She owned nothing. After selling 200 million records, after filling stadiums across 7 continents, after becoming one of the most successful artists of our generation, she owned nothing. Not a single master recording, not one melody, not the heartbreak anthems that defined a decade, nor the love songs that soundtracked a million first dances. Every note, every lyric, every piece of her soul that she poured into those recordings belonged to someone else. And in that devastating realization, in that moment of profound loss, Taylor Swift discovered something that would change the music industry forever. She discovered her voice. Not the one that sang, the one that fought. There's a photograph from 2006. A teenage girl with golden ringlets, holding a guitar almost as tall as she is, standing outside a record label in Nashville. Her eyes are bright with hope, that kind of innocent optimism that belongs only to someone who hasn't yet learned how the world works. She's just signed her first record deal. She's about to become a star. She has no idea what she's just given away. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because to understand why Taylor Swift became the most vocal advocate for artists' rights in modern music history, we need to go back before the stadiums, before the Grammy Awards lined up like soldiers on a shelf, back to when she was just a kid with a dream and a pen that never stopped moving. Taylor Allison Swift was born in Reading, Pennsylvania on December 13, 1989, a cold winter day. Her parents, Scott and Andrea, were comfortable, loving, the kind of family that ate dinner together and actually talked. Her father worked in finance. Her mother had been in marketing. They were stable. They were kind. They gave Taylor everything a child could want. Except they couldn't give her what she needed most. They couldn't make Nashville listen. From the time she was 10 years old, Taylor knew. She didn't hope. She didn't dream. She knew. She was going to be a songwriter. Not a singer who sometimes wrote. Not a performer who dabbled in lyrics. A songwriter. Someone who could take the invisible chaos of human emotion and pin it down with words so precise, so devastatingly accurate, that strangers would hear them and think, "That's exactly how I feel. I just never knew how to say it." Her family took her to Nashville when she was 11. They drove her to every record label on Music Row. They waited in lobbies. They handed out homemade demo CDs with Taylor's name written in marker. They smiled politely when receptionists said the executives were busy. They drove back to Pennsylvania with a car full of rejections and a daughter who refused to quit. So they moved, the whole family, packed up their lives and relocated to Hendersonville, Tennessee, just outside Nashville. Because that's what you do when your child has a gift that won't be ignored. Scott got a job at Merrill Lynch's Nashville office. Andrea became her daughter's full-time advocate, manager, and protector. And Taylor, barely a teenager, started playing every venue that would have her. Coffee shops where nobody listened. Songwriter nights where she was the youngest person in the room by 20 years. Bluebird Cafe open mic nights where industry professionals occasionally stopped by to discover new talent. She played, she wrote, she improved. And then, when she was 14 years old, Sony ATV Music Publishing signed her as a songwriter, the youngest artist they'd ever signed. It was validation, proof that her words mattered. But it wasn't enough. She didn't want to write songs for other people to make famous. She wanted to sing her own stories. That's when Scott Borchetta entered her life. He was a record executive starting his own label, Big Machine Records, a startup in an industry dominated by giants. He'd seen Taylor perform at the Bluebird Cafe. He'd listened to her original songs. He'd recognized something that others had missed. Not just talent, not just youth appeal. He'd seen a once-in-a-generation songwriter wrapped in the package of a teenage girl who could sell that authenticity to millions. He offered her a deal. She was 15 years old. Now, here's what most people don't understand about record deals, especially in Nashville, especially in 2005. They're structured to protect the label, not the artist. The label invests money, takes the risk, And in return, they own the master recordings. That's standard. That's how it's always been done. The artist gets royalties, gets performance fees, gets publishing rights to the compositions. But the actual recordings, the versions that play on the radio and stream on platforms, those belong to the label. She signed. Her parents signed. They read the contract. They understood it. This was the cost of entry. This was how you became a star in the music industry. You gave away ownership in exchange for opportunity. And honestly, at 15, when you're being offered your dream, when a respected executive believes in you enough to start a label with you as the flagship artist, you sign. Her first album dropped in October 2006. Self-titled, simple, raw. Songs she'd written in her bedroom, in her high school cafeteria, in the back seat of cars driving to nowhere. Tim McGraw, Teardrops on My Guitar, Our Song, Picture to Burn. They weren't overproduced, they weren't chasing trends, they were diary entries set to music, and they connected with people in a way that surprised everyone. Except Taylor. She'd always known, words matter. Specificity matters. When you write about real feelings, real moments, real people, listeners don't just hear a song. They remember, they feel, they connect. The album went platinum, then multi-platinum, then 5 times platinum. She was 16 years old and already a household name. But more importantly, she was writing. Every single song on that album she had written or co-written. Most artists, especially teenage artists, sing songs written by professional songwriters. Not Taylor. She insisted on writing her own material. It was non-negotiable. Because for her, it was never about fame. It was about the words. Fearless came next in 2008. Love Story. You Belong With Me. White Horse. 15. The album that proved she wasn't a one-hit wonder, wasn't a teenage novelty act. She was a generational talent. The album won Album of the Year at the Grammys. She was 20 years old, the youngest person to ever win that award. She stood on that stage, blonde curls and sparkly dress, and thanked her fans, her family, her label. She had no idea that same label would break her heart in a way no song could fix. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Throughout her 20s, Taylor became a cultural phenomenon. Speak Now, entirely self-written. Red, with collaborations that pushed her sound into pop territory. 1989, a full embrace of pop that broke every commercial record. Reputation, a darker, defiant response to public backlash. Lover, a return to romantic optimism. 6 albums, hundreds of millions of records sold. Sold-out world tours, countless awards. She was no longer just a country singer from Pennsylvania. She was Taylor Swift, a brand, an empire, a force. But she still didn't own her masters. Every album she recorded under Big Machine Records, every vocal take, every guitar riff, every perfectly crafted production moment belonged to Scott Barchetta and Big Machine. She'd signed that deal when she was 15, and she'd honored it. 6 albums, 13 years. She'd made Big Machine one of the most successful independent labels in history. And now her contract was ending. In 2018, Taylor faced a choice. She could re-sign with Big Machine, the label that made her a star, or she could leave, sign with a major label, negotiate a new deal where she might, maybe, possibly own her future masters.
Scott Barchetta offered her a new contract. She could have her masters, eventually. 1 album at a time. For every new album she recorded, he'd give her back 1 old album. So if she recorded 6 more albums, stayed with Big Machine for another decade, she'd finally own her original work. She'd be in her 40s before she owned the songs she wrote as a teenager. And there was another condition. She couldn't speak negatively about Big Machine or Scott Barchetta. Ever. It would be in the contract, a silencing clause disguised as a business agreement. Taylor declined. She signed with Republic Records and Universal Music Group instead. a new deal where she would own all her future master recordings from day one. It was groundbreaking. Major artists don't get that kind of deal. But Taylor had leverage. She was one of the biggest artists in the world. She could demand terms that others couldn't. She left Big Machine in November 2018. She'd fulfilled her contract, 6 albums, exactly what she'd promised 15-year-old Taylor would deliver. She was free. She was moving forward. She was finally going to own her own work. And then, 6 months later, everything fell apart. In June 2019, Scott Borchetta sold Big Machine Records to Scooter Braun's Ithaca Holdings for $300 million. Every artist on the label, every contract, every master recording sold. Without telling the artists, without giving them a chance to bid on their own work, including Taylor's entire catalog, her first 6 albums, every song, Love Story, You Belong With Me, Shake It Off, Blank Space, Bad Blood, Look What You Made Me Do, every anthem, every heartbreak ballad, every piece of her creative soul from age 15 to 28, now belonged to Scooter Braun. Now, to understand why this devastated Taylor, you need to understand the history between her and Scooter Braun. He was a powerful music manager. He managed Justin Bieber, Ariana Grande, Demi Lovato. He was respected in the industry, known for building careers and protecting his clients. But he'd also, according to Taylor, participated in years of bullying. His clients had publicly mocked her. Social media posts, interviews, the kind of calculated cruelty that celebrities sometimes inflict on each other for clicks and attention. And Scooter, in Taylor's view, had encouraged it, even participated in it. She'd tried to buy her masters herself before the sale. She'd reached out to Scott Borchetta, offered to purchase her own work. He'd refused to even discuss it unless she signed a new contract. And then he sold her life's work to someone she considered an adversary, someone she felt had tormented her, someone who now controlled whether her music could be used in commercials, films, documentaries, someone who would profit from every stream, every download, every radio play of songs she'd written in her childhood bedroom. She was heartbroken, and she was angry. On June 30th, 2019, Taylor did something radical, something that could have destroyed her career, something that most artists, even megastars, would never dare to do. She spoke. She posted a public statement on Tumblr. No publicists' careful wording, no legal team's cautious phrasing, just Taylor writing exactly what she felt. She explained the situation, she explained her history with Scooter Braun, she explained how devastating it was to have her life's work sold to someone she considered an adversary. The post went viral. Within hours, millions of fans had read it. Other artists started responding. Some supported her. Some criticized her for going public. Some pointed out that this is how the music industry works. You don't own your masters unless you're powerful enough to negotiate that from the start. But that's exactly why she spoke up. Because most artists aren't powerful enough. Most artists are like 15-year-old Taylor, signing standard contracts because that's the only way to get a chance. Most artists spend their entire careers making music that enriches everyone except themselves. And Taylor Swift, who now had the platform, the resources, the fan base, the talent, she could speak without fear. She decided to speak for all of them. Over the following months, the situation escalated. There were negotiations, lawyers, public statements, and private meetings. Scooter Braun's team said Taylor was being unreasonable, that she'd been offered chances to buy her masters and declined. Taylor's team said those offers came with unacceptable conditions, gag orders, and impossible terms. The truth, as always, was probably somewhere in the complicated middle. But one thing became crystal clear. Taylor Swift was done being silent about how the music industry treats artists. In November 2019, just before the American Music Awards, where she was being honored as Artist of the Decade, Taylor made another public statement. She revealed that Scott Borchetta and Skewer Braun were trying to control her ability to perform her old songs at the award show. They were blocking her from using her own music in an upcoming Netflix documentary about her life. They were holding her art hostage. The backlash was immediate. Fans organized, other artists spoke out. The restrictions were quietly lifted. Taylor performed her hits at the AMAs. The documentary moved forward. But the larger fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Because Taylor realized something profound in those dark months of 2019. She realized that she had a choice most artists don't have. She had the resources, she had the fan base, she had the talent. She could re-record everything.
Under U.S. copyright law, artists can re-record their songs after a certain number of years have passed since the original recording. The compositions, the lyrics, the melodies, those Taylor owned through publishing rights. But the actual recordings belong to Big Machine, now owned by Scooter Braun, unless she made new recordings, new versions that sounded virtually identical to the originals, new versions that she would own completely. It would take years. It would cost millions. It would require re-entering the headspace of her teenage self, her 20-year-old self, her 25-year-old self, and recreating albums that were emotionally tied to specific moments in her past. But she'd own them. In August 2020, she announced it. She was going to re-record her first 6 albums, Taylor's version. She was taking back her narrative. She was reclaiming her art. The industry was shocked. Some executives called it petty. Some said it would never work. Some predicted the re-recordings would sound hollow, that fans wouldn't care about subtle differences in production. They were wrong. Fearless Taylor's version dropped in April 2021. It was nearly identical to the original, with subtle production updates and 6 additional songs from the vault. Songs she'd written during that era but never released. Fans didn't just buy it, they streamed it exclusively. They deliberately chose Taylor's version over the original. Within weeks, the re-recording was charting higher than the original ever had. She'd done it. She'd proven that artists could fight back against unfair contracts, not with lawyers and lawsuits, but with creativity and fan support. Red Taylor's version followed in November 2021. Speak Now Taylor's version in July 2023. 1989 Taylor's version in October 2023. Each release was an event. Each one charted at number 1. Each one generated hundreds of millions of streams. And every single stream, every single download, every single dollar earned went to Taylor. But here's the thing. This isn't a story about money. Taylor Swift is wealthy beyond measure. She could have walked away, focused on new music, let the old catalog fade into someone else's portfolio. The financial impact on her personal wealth would have been negligible. She did this for a different reason. Throughout this entire battle, Taylor used her platform to agitate. She explained master recordings to fans who'd never heard the term. She talked about publishing rights, royalty structures, how streaming pays artists fractions of pennies per play. She spoke at award shows. She wrote op-eds. She used her acceptance speeches not to thank people, but to advocate for change. In 2019, she publicly supported the Music Modernization Act, legislation designed to update how songwriters and artists are paid in the streaming era. She met with legislators. She used her influence to push for fairer industry standards. When Spotify was paying artists almost nothing per stream, Taylor pulled her entire catalog from the platform in 2014. She wasn't big enough then to own her masters, but she was big enough to make a statement about artist compensation. She stayed off Spotify for 3 years until they changed their payment structures. When Apple Music launched and announced they wouldn't pay artists during the free trial period, Taylor wrote an open letter. Within 24 hours, Apple reversed their policy. Because when Taylor Swift speaks, the industry listens.
But more importantly, when Taylor Swift fights, other artists find courage to fight too. After she went public about her masters, dozens of artists started speaking about their own contracts. Kelly Clarkson suggested Taylor should re-record her albums, which helped plant the seed for that strategy. Megan Thee Stallion spoke about her label disputes. FKA Twigs talked about contractual control. Halsey posted on social media about having to manufacture virality for label approval. The conversation changed. Artists who'd been suffering in silence realized they weren't alone. Young musicians started asking questions about their contracts before signing. Lawyers started advising clients differently because Taylor proved something crucial. She proved that transparency doesn't destroy careers. Speaking up doesn't make you difficult or ungrateful. Fighting for your rights isn't the same as being entitled. It's being professional. In November 2020, Scooter Braun sold the masters to Taylor's first 6 albums to an investment fund called Shamrock Holdings for reportedly over $300 million. He'd owned them barely a year. He made tens of millions in profit, and then he walked away, probably recognizing that the re-recordings were going to devalue his investment anyway. Taylor released a statement. She'd tried to work with Shamrock Holdings, tried to negotiate a purchase, but Scooter Braun would still profit from any deal, and she refused to participate in that. So she doubled down on the re-recordings. She chose the hard path, the path that required years of work, the path that meant reliving old heartbreaks and past versions of herself, the path that prioritized principle over convenience. And in doing so, she created a blueprint. Today, young artists negotiate differently because of Taylor Swift. Labels think twice before including restrictive clauses because of Taylor Swift. Conversations about ownership and fairness happen openly because of Taylor Swift. She didn't do this alone. There were lawyers, managers, producers, her family, her fans who supported every decision. But she was the one who had to make the choice. She was the one who had to go public when every industry advisor probably told her to stay quiet, protect her brand, don't make waves. She made waves anyway, because somewhere in that teenage girl who played open mic nights in Nashville, who signed a contract at 15 because it was her only shot, who poured her heart into 6 albums without truly understanding what she was giving away. Somewhere in that young woman who became one of the most successful artists of all time, who filled stadiums and broke records and won every award. Somewhere in all of that success, in all of that heartbreak, in all of those songs about love and loss and growing up, she remembered what it felt like to be powerless. And she decided that no artist should ever feel that way again if she could help it. There's a recording from 2021. Taylor is backstage at the Brit Awards, and someone asks her about the re-recordings, about whether it's worth the effort, about whether fans really care about master ownership. And she says something profound. She says that when you create something, when you write a song or paint a picture or build something with your own hands, it should belong to you. Not because of money, not because of pride, but because it's yours. It came from your heart, your mind, your experience, and no contract should ever be able to take that away forever. She pauses. She looks directly at the camera, and she says, "I'm doing this so that the next teenager who signs a record deal will ask different questions, so they'll understand what they're agreeing to, so they'll know they have power even if they don't feel powerful yet." That's the legacy she's building. Not just re-recorded albums, not just billion-dollar tours and record-breaking sales. She's building a music industry where artists understand their worth, where creativity isn't automatically traded away for opportunity, where the people who make the art actually benefit from the art they make. Is the system fixed? No. The music industry is still structured to favor labels and executives. Contracts are still complicated and often unfair. Young artists still sign away their rights because they don't see another option. But it's different now. The conversation exists. Artists talk to each other, share information, compare contracts. There are social media threads where musicians discuss their deals openly. There are lawyers who specialize in artist-friendly negotiations. And when a label tries to control an artist unfairly, when a manager crosses a line, when someone with power exploits someone without it, people remember what Taylor Swift did. They remember that you can fight back, that speaking up isn't career destruction, that fans will support authenticity and integrity even when it's complicated.
She's still re-recording. 2 more albums to go, Reputation and her debut album, Taylor Swift. By the time she's finished, she'll own complete versions of all her recorded music. The originals will still exist, still owned by someone else, but they'll be irrelevant, forgotten, replaced by versions that she controls. And every time a young artist negotiates a record deal, every time they ask about master ownership or royalty rates or creative control, Taylor Swift is in the room. Not literally, but her influence, her example, her refusal to stay silent, it changed the conversation forever. There's an interview from 2023. Taylor is talking about the Eras Tour, the concert film, the re-recordings, all of it. And the interviewer asks her why. Why through all this effort? Why fight battles that don't really affect her anymore? Why not just focus on new music and let the past go? She thinks for a moment, and then she tells a story. When she was 15, just after signing with Big Machine, she went to a songwriting workshop in Nashville. There were maybe 20 people in the room, mostly older musicians and professional writers. The instructor was teaching them about publishing rights, about how the business worked behind the songs. And Taylor raised her hand. She asked a question about master recordings, about why artists don't own them. And the instructor, this older man who'd been in the industry for decades, he laughed. Not meanly, but dismissively. Like she'd asked why the sky is blue or why rain falls down. He said, because that's how it works. That's the deal. You write the songs, you perform them, and the label owns the recordings. If you don't like it, don't sign. Taylor went home that night and cried because she'd already signed, because she realized she'd given away something precious without fully understanding it, because that instructor had made her feel stupid for even asking. She tells this story, and her eyes get that look, that fierce, determined look that appears whenever she talks about unfairness. And she says, I'm doing this for 15-year-old me. The girl who didn't know enough to negotiate better. The girl who just wanted someone to believe in her music. I'm doing this so that the next time some teenager asks that question, someone in the room will have a different answer. They'll say, actually, that's changing. Actually, artists are starting to own their work. Actually, someone fought for this, and now you have options. That's why she fights. Not for the money, not for the recognition, not even really for herself. She fights for the kids who don't know what they're signing, for the artists who feel powerless in an industry built to exploit them, for everyone who creates something beautiful and then watches someone else profit from it forever. She fights because she can. Has the platform, the resources, the stubbornness to make a difference. And in a world where most people with power use it to gain more power, Taylor Swift uses hers to change the rules. That's the story most people miss. They see the re-recordings as revenge. They see her public statements as drama. They reduce this complicated years-long battle to celebrity gossip and tabloid headlines. But the people who actually work in music, the songwriters, producers, session musicians, backup singers, artists trying to build careers, they understand. They understand that what Taylor Swift did was revolutionary. She used transparency as a weapon. She turned her fans into advocates for industry change. She proved that artists can reclaim their narratives, their art, their worth. And she did it without compromising her integrity, without burning bridges unnecessarily, without becoming bitter or cynical. She did it by continuing to create,
by releasing new albums that broke records, by touring in a way that redefined what concerts could be, by writing songs that connected with people just as deeply at 33 as they did at 16. She did it by being excellent at her craft, while also fighting for systemic change, which is perhaps the most powerful statement of all. Because it proves that standing up for yourself, advocating for others, refusing to accept unfairness, none of that diminishes your art. If anything, it enhances it. It gives your work deeper meaning. It connects your creativity to your values. And maybe that's the real lesson in all of this. Maybe the reason Taylor Swift fights for artists' rights isn't because of that contract she signed at 15. It isn't because Scooter Braun bought her masters. It isn't even because the music industry has historically exploited creators. Maybe she fights because she understands something fundamental about art and humanity. She understands that creating something meaningful is one of the most vulnerable things a person can do. You take your feelings, your experiences, your truth, and you shape them into something tangible, a song, a painting, a story. And then you share it with the world, hoping it will connect, hoping it will matter. And when someone takes that vulnerability and turns it into a commodity they control, when they profit from your openness without honoring its source, that's not just a business transaction. That's a betrayal of the creative act itself. So she fights because fighting is the only way to honor that act. The only way to say that art matters, that artists matter, that the people who create beauty in this world deserve to benefit from that beauty. She fights because staying silent would be a betrayal of every song she's ever written. Every lyric about standing up for yourself, about not accepting less than you deserve, about finding your voice even when the world tries to silence you. She fights because her entire career has been built on authenticity, on telling the truth through music, and speaking up about injustice, about unfairness, about systems that need to change. That's just another form of truth-telling. In the end, this isn't a story about contracts or master recordings or re-recorded albums. Those are just the details, the framework. This is a story about a woman who could have taken the easy path, who could have stayed quiet, stayed wealthy, stayed comfortable, who could have let the system continue exactly as it was, because it had worked out fine for her in the end. But instead, she chose the harder path, the path that required vulnerability and courage and years of work, the path that meant standing up publicly and saying, "This isn't right," even when powerful people tried to make her stop. She chose that path because she remembered what it felt like to be 15 and powerless, and she refused to let that feeling define another generation of artists. That's the only reason Taylor Swift fights for artists' rights. Not because she has to, because she can. And because somewhere, right now, there's a teenage songwriter sitting in a bedroom, scribbling lyrics in a journal, dreaming of Nashville and record deals and success. And when that teenager grows up, when they face their own battles with the industry, they'll remember that Taylor Swift fought and won. And maybe, just maybe, they'll find the courage, because that's what art does at its best. It doesn't just entertain. It doesn't just make us feel. It shows us what's possible when we refuse to accept what's wrong. And if that's not worth fighting for, then nothing is. If this story reminded you why artists matter, subscribe to Quiet Fame for more journeys into the hearts of the creators who shaped our world. Because every voice deserves to be heard. Every artist deserves to own their truth.